offers rational actors the choice to choose between different cost-benefit functions. You give them the option between different sets of preferences. Then, according to Parsons, you preserve individual autonomy, but you do so at the cost of not being able to explain how these many isolated individuals are able to produce a social order again. So he criticizes basically this invisible hand metaphor as insufficient to explain social order. So Parsons also relates to many of his prior thinkers who already offered solutions of how to solve the problem of double contingency. He's very critical of, let's say, Cartesian, so René Descartes inspired approaches, because Descartes, in his let's say, search for absolute certainty about sort of epistemic truths, modeled individual actors as very isolated human beings, only in exchange with sort of the objects in the world, not with social actors. And Parsons is really critical of any kind of Cartesian approaches to this problem of double contingency. And he's, as you may have noticed, himself quite close to more Durkheimian answers to this problem. And Parsons' solutions is very close to this. So he says in the problem of double contingency, the answer of actors is basically to have a shared normative basis, right? To have shared normative understandings, to also have sort of shared memberships in societies while maintaining differentiated roles, obviously. So that in, for instance, the double contingency problem here as a zero-sum game, there are certain normative rules about who gets what, right? This is negotiated in politics. In the problem of the uncertainty and coordination dilemmas, there are certain norms, right? Such as the city is characterized by its cathedral, and therefore we should meet at the cathedral. And in problems of collective actions, for instance, there's a certain norm that you should advance trust when you interact with strangers, for instance. And this is how you overcome the security dilemma. Yeah? So this is in brief then the Parsonian and also, if you want, Durkheimian answer to that problem of order, or the problem in situations of social interactions that create double contingency. So Parsons does obviously not stop there in developing his action theory. The question is a little bit what kind of norms, or as Parsons puts it in his quite distinct and unique vocabulary, what kind of patterns or pattern variables, because they vary across society, regulate actually our different institutions. And he comes up with basically pairs of four. The number 4 is quite important for Parsonian categories for some reasons. And I wanted to briefly introduce these 4 pattern variables using also one of the more concrete examples that Parsonian sociology offers here, and that is in his analysis of the medical profession. Yeah. So think about this as a comparison of the norms that govern the medical profession in comparison to, for instance, business. Yeah. So, or like sort of free market kind of business. And the first pattern variable along which these two institutions then differ is the value or the goal orientation, where, according to Parsons, the medical profession has basically developed an orientation towards the collective good of healing patients, right, which is enshrined also in the Hippocratic Oath, or this notion of the welfare of the patient, which comes first, right? Sort of, if you see someone suffering, as a doctor, you just intervene. It's a norm that you need to help. And this is different, this collective orientation, when compared, for instance, to the individual orientation that predominates in the egotistic kind of behavior that is also a norm, but a norm more in business practices. Yeah? Obviously, there is nowadays also the attempt of something like business ethics, right? And you can go to business schools and hear about business ethics, but it's probably still the case that, let's say, self-interest, sort of individual self-interest orientation is the predominant norm in business context. And if you don't follow this norm, then you are rather considered as awkward. And norm also implies sanctions, right? So it's not just a convention, right? We basically do this because we could also agree on another convention. Otherwise, a norm, already in Max Weber's sense, is a convention that is additionally backed up by sanctioning, and also third-party kind of sanctioning. If, as a doctor, you don't follow this collective norm of helping others, patients in case of need, then you get sanctioned. And you may also get sanctioned simply because, as a businessman, you don't show proper sort of a display of rational self-interest. Okay, so a second kind of pattern variable then is along the lines of diffuse and sort of specific role specialization. And here, doctors here specialize, right, in the treatment of very specialized or specific medical problems. That is, there is a differentiated role system. There is the patient versus the doctor. Obviously, there are many different doctors. So here the medical profession sort of scores along the specific or very specialized role orientation lines. And this is different, for instance, to, let's say, more let's say simpler structured societies. Think about smaller societies where there's an easy interchange also of roles. Think also about buyer-seller kind of situations where on eBay, right, you can easily become a seller or a buyer in the next moment. So there's not a very specific role specialization going on. A third dimension in pattern variables here is whether there is an effective or a neutral kind of relationship institutionalized in the role of doctors. And here the professional ethics prescribe neutrality when caring about patients, right? This is different from, let's say, effective. We would also negatively put it nepotistic ways of referring to patients, where so the sort of doctor's niece gets the treatment, but not sort of the stranger. And here, value neutrality, or like professional neutrality, is the norm for the medical profession, whereas effective norms rather govern in, let's say, kinship relationships. Last but not least, the pattern variable describing doctors' relationships with patients again is universality, right? In the sense of doctors have to treat any kind of patient that falls sort of in their professional domain. Well, not basically just patients of the very same family, but yes, also sort of not only patients, for instance, who can pay for the service. This is again different when compared to business relationships where the pattern variable is not as universal, where the ability to pay is a precondition then of a more particular kind of social relationship. Yeah. So this is just to give you a little bit of an idea of how this very abstract action theory of Parsons that sees norms as the solution to the problem of double contingency can be fruitfully used also to describe the functions, if you want, of different institutions in society. Okay, yeah, last but not least, let's also add that in meritocratic societies also there is the norm of doctors to basically be evaluated by the performance, and they do not achieve their status simply by ascription. Yeah? So this is a little bit Parsons paraphrasing the distinction between status and, let's say, contract societies, where in the more traditional society, the status of a person depends on the ascription of certain, for instance, nobility titles already given by birth, whereas in sort of modern contract societies, meritocratically organized society, it is the achievement, the performance of a person that then gives a certain status to a person. Okay, Parsons does not stop there. I mentioned that the later Parsons develops an entire theory of social systems of society. So here I refer to the later Parsons and introduce briefly the AGIL or Agile scheme, which again, think about it as a way to categorize the different, let's say, norms that govern society. And in this particular case, not only, let's say, small personal interactions or, let's say, the personality system interacting with other personality systems, but including also the, let's say, cultural system and any kind of other social system. So Parsons distinguished then between these different kinds of systems, which are also then interlinked in the sense that the sort of personality systems interacting in social system institutionalize sort of certain norms, institutionalize also certain cultural systems, and through the education system, for instance, then they internalize in terms certain norms, they get socialized. So there is what Parsons calls interpenetration also of the different systems. Yeah. Then every one of these systems, including the entire social system, can be analyzed according to Parsons by this agile scheme. Yeah. So broadly speaking, every kind of system needs to have these four different functions in order to exist. There are, let's say, two functions which regulate the interaction of the system with, let's say, other systems or